Hello and welcome to a very short lecture on the second element of the Nazi consolidation of power. This is the term that we're going to refer to today. It's also this German word Gleichschaltung, which roughly translated means coordination. What does this mean in terms of the actions that take place roughly between April 1933 through until 1934? Well, it really just means the Nazification of German institutions and the Nazification of what I guess were aspects of Weimar Germany, and the shift towards obviously a more authoritarian and totalitarian state. But it's done in such a way that the Nazis like to give the impression that they had been given permission to do what they do across German society because of the Enabling Act, and therefore we're going to look at just basically how the Nazis, in a fairly short space of time, are able to take control over most of the different institutions and different features of German life. Now, ultimately, the principles underpinning Gleichschaltung is the removal of dissent. If the Nazis are going to govern Germany for at least the next 4 years, as the Enabling Act had permitted, then they had to do so within an environment that they could not be questioned or challenged in terms of what they were planning to do. And therefore, to have this kind of free run at governing Germany, you had to remove all forms of opposition. We've already seen to some extent the beginnings of this process with the attacks on the Communist Party, so that kind of perception that Hitler and the Nazis were able to kind of establish within Germany in January through to March 1933, that there was a potential communist uprising just waiting to happen. That allowed for the suppression of the communists in the lead up to the Enabling Act. What we're going to see post March 1933 is the removal of all dissent. Now, that doesn't quite happen immediately for the Nazis. Some areas of German society are easier to kind of suppress than others. Some institutions are so big that the Nazis can't necessarily address these areas as quickly as they would like. So, for example, the church or the army. So we will touch on some of these, but really what we're talking about with Gleichschaltung is bringing all aspects of German society into the kind of Nazi way of thinking and the Nazi way of doing things, and at the same time removing dissent or potential dissent. Now, on the left hand side here you see this image. This is an image of a place that we've already made reference to, Dachau concentration camp, the first major concentration camp within Germany. And the gates to Dachau have obviously these very famous words on them. These words were then exported to other Nazi concentration camps, and then obviously more poignantly were exported to Nazi extermination camps, the most famous one obviously being Auschwitz, where Arbeit macht frei can be still found on the gates there today. Dachau gates have the same words written on them, which just means work liberates, which was an ironic phrase because most people who were into concentration camps, and then definitely when it came to the extermination camps, which are different, work did not liberate, work resulted in death more often than not. So I'll touch a little bit on the concentration camp system today, but mostly that's something that we'll get to in future classes. So we know that the Nazis have started this process of addressing how to deal with dissent in terms of how they tackled the threat of communism, or the kind of manufactured threat of communism. And Hitler is kind of quite happy to kind of take this kind of model of kind of dealing with the communists and then apply it to the socialists. So the Socialist Party are treated pretty much in the same way, and in the early days of Dachau, most of the prisoners who end up there are communists and socialists. Now, I did mention previously that the Nazis do have a Christmas amnesty in 1933, and some of these socialists and communists are basically let out and they can go back home. But that in 1934 it was kind of quickly turned around, and many of them found themselves back in concentration camps, never to leave after this point. So if you were a socialist or a communist, you did the right thing, and you in early 1934 left Germany. So Dachau would accommodate political opponents of the regime. Now, I guess the Nazis could get away with this type of behaviour. They could justify to the majority of the German population that it was okay to put socialists and communists in work camps because they deserved it. And the middle classes and the ruling classes and the elites and industrialists, etc., were actually okay with this. We should always remember that, right? There was not any kind of real great opposition to the concentration camp system. And the concentration camp system was there for people to be aware of it. This is different than the extermination camps, which the world was never to know about, but the concentration camps were there so that Germans knew, and they were not publicised, but they weren't hidden, but they were there so that people were conscious of the fact that they themselves, if they were to oppose the regime, could end up in such a place. And from very early on in the Nazi regime, those who were sent to places like Dachau, and then in 1934 there's other camps that are built. Sachsenhausen is built in the Berlin area. From very early on, there are prisoners who are shot and killed by the SA or the SS who are running these camps. We'll come to the difference between those two groups in a future lesson. So the next, I guess, phase of Gleichschaltung will try to remove dissent and coordinate all aspects of the Weimar Republic into a new Nazi regime. Really is a way can be looked at by focusing on 8 different areas, and here they are. Here the Nazis believed that these were the aspects of German society that had to be transformed in such a way that the Nazis could have full control over what was going on within Germany. Now, in some of these instances, there's a complete transformation. In other instances, there is very little that changes. In some instances, so we take number 1, for example, the civil service, the Nazis will put their own men in, right? So there will be the odd Nazi now working for the civil service next to somebody else who's not a Nazi, but that other person might be, you know, a nationalist of, let's say, the DVP or the DMVP. And the Nazis actually, or Hitler and his regime, at first didn't really have a problem with kind of doubling up people doing the same job. It reduced unemployment figures for a start. When it comes to the civil service, the main kind of purge, if you like, was in regards to the political left. Anybody had left leanings and worked for the civil service, i.e. that group of people who do all of the kind of administrative work for the government, those who were left leaning, they are the ones who lose their jobs. They are seen as being unfit for office now. So there are changes that take place in the civil service. The question of the role of Jews is something that you can read about. The Jews are not immediately persecuted by the Nazis, but it comes quite quickly, and we know that on the 1st of April we see the first examples or instances of overt anti-Semitic behaviour with the boycott of Jewish shops and stores across Germany. It only lasts one day because Hitler and his finance minister Hjalmar Schacht are fearful of the economic consequences of a boycott, especially of the kind of slightly larger Jewish department stores. So it doesn't last long, but we can start to see this attack on the Jews becoming more acceptable and more public. In regards to the civil service, we'll read about the fact that Jews start to lose their jobs. Trade union movement has to go. There's no doubt about that at all. And again, Hitler has kind of got support for that from the elites, the people that have put him into office. Remember the source that we looked at from the previous lesson, source C, which touched on how Hitler was kind of promising big business industrialists that Marxism will be eliminated. So the removal of the trade union movement and it being replaced by a Nazi kind of workers movement known as the DAF, right, the Deutsche Arbeit Front, the German Labour Front, that was a kind of Nazi controlled trade union system which was not radical at all and was friendly towards employers, didn't represent workers really in the way that trade unions had. So there's support for that. I should actually say at this point, I didn't mention it when we looked at the Enabling Act and the kind of legal revolution, but one of the things that Hitler can probably get away with is these kind of attacks on the communists and the socialists and the trade unions, because he is presenting himself as a kind of respectable character who is, making clear that his ultimate intentions are to make Germany the country that it once was. Right, he's very much about returning Germany to its kind of place of power and prestige within Europe. And on the left-hand side, you can see reference to something that happens on the 21st of March 1933, just 2 days before the Enabling Act. It's known as the Day of Potsdam, and this was a ceremonial event that was staged, managed by the Nazis to give the impression that Hindenburg, who turns up at Potsdam, which is just outside Berlin, at this cathedral, and at the church, Hindenburg meets Hitler and they shake hands over the grave of Frederick the Great, the great German leader of the past. And it's a kind of an attempt by the Nazis to show that the old guard, Hindenburg, the old nationalist monarchist guard, are handing over the reins of power to Hitler, and Hitler and the Nazis are very mindful of the heritage that they are inheriting, and therefore the view is that Hitler's going to act in a very respectable, conservative way. And these elites who view this kind of transition or handing over of power are quite happy to see Hitler purge the civil service of communists. They're happy to see trade unions dissolved. So it's a kind of clever move by Hitler and the Nazis, and it might allow them to get away with certain things during this period. But what I would say is the conservative elements within German society are already kind of coordinated to the Nazi way of thinking. The Weimar Republic was not a hotbed of left-wing radicalism. So when we look at the final 3 examples here, 6, 7 and 8, judiciary, army and medical profession, they were already kind of conservative and right-wing, and very little coordination was required. So we know, right, that judges in the past have been very lenient towards those on the political right, have been very lenient to Hitler himself, who in spite of trying to start an uprising and in spite of committing treason in 1923, he's kind of hit with a very short 9-month prison sentence, which was hardly hard labour. Obviously the army don't really need coordinated because they've got the similar outlook as Hitler and the Nazis. They want an end to Versailles, they want Germany to start the process of rearmament. The army are expansionist in the way that Hitler and the Nazis are. So they've got very similar views. The medical profession, for whatever reason, was incredibly conservative, and one of the more sinister elements of German society under the Nazis is obviously the way that the medical profession allowed and tolerated and was often responsible for the treatment of people who had physical illnesses or mental illnesses, and they carried out some of the kind of nasty work and nasty ideas that emanated out of Nazi ideology. The other areas that I have not touched on, number 3, 4 and 5, you'll get a chance to read about in your own time. But very briefly, number 5, why bother with political parties if they're not a Reichstag that is functioning as part of a proper democracy? So you don't need political parties. So political parties are dissolved, or they basically dissolve, right? So that's the case with the Centre Party, who are not that keen on it, but they do so because they've been guaranteed some independence from the Catholic Church. The DNVP, DVP kind of accept their fate, and they are, as I said, already kind of in line with what Hitler and the Nazis are planning on. But the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, they are banned. The press, well, I guess Germany under the Weimar regime was a free democratic society, so you have newspapers and journals and magazines that can really say as they please, but that's also going to come to an end. Under the Nazi regime, there's only really going to be room for one truth, one way of thinking, and that's the Nazi way of thinking. And there are still other newspapers. It's not just as if there's only one newspaper, the Nazi newspaper, the Volkischer Beobachter. There are other newspapers, but these other newspapers really have to self-regulate and self-censor, and if they step out of line, then they'll find themselves being banned. So the Nazis can kind of control the press, because the press are, more often than not, the big newspapers, controlled by wealthy magnates who see it in their interest to support the Nazis. And finally, state governments. The Nazis really just weren't rid of state governments because state governments are independent. State governors might do as they please and not follow the Nazi central line. So what the Nazis want is Berlin taking greater control of everything. And what we see as part of this Gleichschaltung process is 18 German Nazi dominated states are created across Germany. The idea of federalism really disappears. At the head of each of these 18 regional areas is a leader. This leader is known as a Gauleiter, who is a Nazi, basically. A Nazi now controls each of the major states within Germany, and each of these Gauleiters follows the central line that comes from the party in Berlin. Ultimately, they're following what Hitler and his cronies determined should be policy or ideology. So this is the process of Gleichschaltung. It's not that complicated, it's just there's a lot of stuff that the Nazis try and bring into line. Some of these things they do so fairly quickly, others take a bit longer. I haven't really made reference to the churches, as I said, that kind of comes a bit later. The other key policy aim that the Nazis are interested in at this point is this term I've made reference to before called the Volksgemeinschaft, the national people's community, and that is something which the Nazis do see as a long-term vision. Once all of these areas that are listed here are kind of where the Nazis want them, then they can start to focus on building the perfect German/Nazi National Socialist society, the society that will, at the very heart of it, have racial ideology, and the Nazis will also start to think more about foreign policy and how the country might expand and grow. So we'll come to all of those points in a future lesson. But for now, that's all I want to talk about in terms of what we call Gleichschaltung. Thank you.